asking, well, what has this got to do with math class? Well, a lot, and you're going to see why in just a moment.
Disneyland, located in Orange County, California, opened its doors on July 17, 1955. Disneyland is divided into several different themed areas where people can enjoy different sorts of rides. Disney's Mickey Mouse character made him famous and features prominently in the park along with other of his characters. Sleeping Beauty Castle draws you into the park and lets you know you're in a fantastical place. You travel to Sleeping Beauty Castle along Main Street, which is a nostalgic look back at what old towns might have been like over 100 years ago. Of course, Disneyland is perhaps most famous for its amazing rides and attractions, some of which are unique to Disneyland or perhaps just a little bit different than ones you might find in other Magic Kingdom parks. Today we're going to look at one ride in particular of all his rides, and which one is that? This one! Space Mountain. Space Mountain is located in Tomorrowland, and it's an indoor steel roller coaster ride. While not as steep and scary or fast as some more modern roller coasters, Space Mountain takes place in the dark, which makes it a little bit extra scary, and as always there's a little bit of Disney magic mixed in to make it even more fun.
I'm standing in front of Space Mountain in Disneyland, California. There are two Space Mountains in the United States, one here in California, the other one is in Orlando, Florida. The one behind me, even though this is an older park, it was built second at Space Station 77. And your task is to, well, if you look down at both of these from space, you will see that both of them are circular. So I would like you to calculate the area of both Space Mountains using the area formula for circles. You're going to need to calculate the radius of both of these Space Mountains. And then once you have the area, I want you to find the percentage difference of each of these areas.
Okay, that went by a little bit quickly. Let's review what we're trying to do here. So if you were flying over Space Mountain in the air, you would see that it is a circular shape. Our task is to compare the areas of the two different Space Mountains, one in California and the one in Florida, and find the percent of change between them. And in case you forgot, the area of a circle is pi r squared, where r is the radius. And just a reminder, we are finding area, not volume, just to simplify the question a little bit. So we need the radius. How are we going to find the radius of this building? Well, it's a circular shape, and I'm noticing there are a lot of spokes that are emanating from the center. So what we can do is try and figure out what is the distance between each of those spokes. And since we can figure out the number of spokes, we can probably get a good approximation of the circumference. So let's count them. There are 36 of these spokes emanating around Space Mountain. So if I can just figure out the distance between one set of spokes and multiply that by 36, I've got their circumference. I have a problem though in that I didn't bring my tape measure or ruler or yardstick with me to Disneyland, so I had to invent a new unit of measurement. The Grieser foot. I used my feet to measure the distance between each of the spokes. So I found a spot in the interior of Space Mountain inside the building that was between two of the exterior spokes. And so I used my Grieser feet to count off how many Grieser feet there are between two spokes in Space Mountain in Disneyland. So how many Grieser feet were there between the spokes in Disneyland Space Mountain? It turns out there are 21 Grieser feet between the spokes of Space Mountain in Disneyland. Well, if you recall, we counted the number of spokes in this circular shape that is Space Mountain, and there are 36 different spokes. So think about it. You've got 36 of these spokes, and there's 21 Grieser feet between the spokes. With that information, we can find the circumference of Space Mountain, or at least something pretty close to the circumference of Space Mountain. So once we have circumference, we know the formula for how we find the circumference of a circle. Its circumference equals 2 times pi times radius. So we can now find the radius. So your job is to figure out what is that radius, and then use the radius in the a equals pi r squared formula to find the area. Remember that our unit of measure is Grieser feet, so the radius and the area and everything you find will be relative to Grieser feet. At this point, you might want to pause the video just so you can sort of either figure out the radius or the area, or at least write down the important information. Our work here in California is done. On to Florida.
Riding the little train in the airport, and I'll see you next at Walt Disney World.
Disney has this amazing service called Disney's Magical Express to get you to the parks. But I think it's misnamed. For our purposes, Disney's Mathematical Express is much more appropriate.
Here I am at Disney World in Orange County, Florida, and behind me is Cinderella Castle this time, and we're going to go take some measurements of the Space Mountain here in Magic Kingdom and see how they compare with the measurements that we took of Space Mountain in Anaheim, California.
Disney World opened its doors on October 1st, 1971, and originally it was created as a way to raise money for Disney's real dream of creating Epcot, which he wanted to be a working city with all kinds of cool stuff in it. That didn't happen. They only made a theme park for Epcot, but we did get this wonderful Magic Kingdom here on the East Coast. Like Disneyland before it, Disney World is known for its fabulous rides and attractions. Some of them are similar or almost exactly the same as the ones in Disneyland, and some are unique to Disney World only.
I'm standing in front of Space Mountain in Florida. This is Spaceport 75, the first Space Mountain built by the Disney Corporation. It is a steel roller coaster that runs in the dark. A lot of fun for those of you who like roller coasters. Our job here today, though, is we want to figure out the distance between two of the ribs on the roof. And this is to help us figure out the circumference of Space Mountain so that we can come up with the radius. So let's go give it a try.
Space Mountain in Florida was the first one to be built, and it is known as Spaceport 75 for the year that it was built. And it is a much beloved ride of almost everybody who travels to Disney World. When you look at Space Mountain in Florida from the air, it's quite different from the one in California. Many more spokes. Space Mountain in Disneyland, California had 36 spokes. The one in Florida has 72 spokes.
This is about as close as I can get to the exterior of Space Mountain here in Florida. So I could not find an interior hallway that was between two of the ribs like I was able to do in California. However, I did notice from the satellite picture that two sets of ribs, meaning I guess 3 ribs together, is about the width of the People Mover ride, which I'm standing under. So the People Mover is a Tomorrowland ride where you kind of just take a little tour. So above me is you look up a little bit, is the track for that. So what I'm going to count out is the width of the track of the people mover, and that should give me 2 sets of ribs, and then we can divide by 2 and get 1 set of ribs. So to mark out the first boundary, I have a volunteer to help me here. This is Joseph. So he is standing kind of at the one edge of the width of the people mover, and then if you pan to the left there a little bit, there is a lamppost, and just beyond it, that's about the end of the width of the people mover. So I'm going to start counting that out. In Grieser feet, of course.
When I finished my count, it was about 32 Grieser feet, maybe closer to 31.5 Grieser feet. So remember, that was 2 sets of ribs that were the 32 Grieser feet. So I need to divide by 2 to get the distance between 1 set of ribs. And I actually used 31.5 Grieser feet because it was a little bit less than 32. And so when I divided by 2, I got 15.75 Grieser feet, and that would be the distance between 1 set of ribs. So now the process is a lot like what we did with Disneyland. So you can figure out the circumference by multiplying by 72 this time, and now you have the circumference in Grieser feet. So use the circumference formula to come up with the radius of the Space Mountain in Disney World. So now that you have the radius from the circumference formula, use that radius in the area formula to come up with the area of Space Mountain in Disney World. So I think we have all the information we need to reach our goal. We've forgotten at this point. Our goal was to find the percent of change in the areas between Space Mountains in Disneyland versus Disney World. So when we measured the distance between 2 spokes or ribs, I used 2 different terms, whether I was in Disneyland versus Disney World, but I mean the same thing, those rib-like features in the roofs of the buildings. There were 21 Grieser feet between the spokes or ribs in Disneyland Space Mountain, and there were 36 total spokes. In Disney World, however, we estimated about 15.75 Grieser feet between these spokes, and a total of 72 of the spokes total on the roof of the building. Using this information, you can figure out the radius of each of these Space Mountains, and once you have the radius, you can figure out the areas. So you're going to use percent of change to figure out the difference between these areas. And if you don't remember how to do that skill, which was a pre-algebra skill, go ahead and Google it, look it up, figure out how to find that percent of change, and then work it out. When you are done, we are going to actually look at the solution to this problem next class.